Hello, this is Rajiv Talwar, and the purpose of this recording is to discuss commodity codes in Ariba. As far as our agenda, we will start off by looking at the different types of commodity codes actually supported by the system. Ariba does come prepackaged with the UN-SPSC commodity code structure, but it is possible to support custom commodity codes if your ERP has those. Next, we'll talk about where are commodity codes used. And commodity codes actually drive a wide variety of functions in Ariba, and we will visit each. Then we'll look at a user interface view to show you how you can drill down in the commodity code search to anywhere from the 2-digit to the 8-digit level within the UNSPSC hierarchy. We'll follow that up by viewing how commodity codes are actually configured in the system. So we will take a look at the master data, and particularly one file that's very important called the ERP commodity code map. And that's actually used to drive default accounting in the system. So we'll take a look at how that mapping is accomplished and also the benefits and importance of that mapping. Towards the end, we'll take a look at a few other areas that are driven by commodity codes, such as approval rules, how tax is calculated on invoices, and receiving types based on commodity. As far as next steps, hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll have an idea of how commodity codes work and how they can be set up. You can start thinking about how they should be set up in your own instance of Ariba. As far as the types of commodity codes supported by Ariba, there are 3. As I mentioned earlier, the system does come prepackaged with the UN-SPSC commodity code structure. That stands for the United Nations Standard Products and Services Codes. They can be anywhere from 2 digits to 8 digits, and we'll visit that structure in detail a little bit later on. Secondly, we have something called ERP or partition commodity codes that are supported. Now these are optional, and this is if your company has a custom commodity code structure in your ERP. It doesn't matter if your ERP is SAP, Oracle, PeopleSoft, or some other generic variant. We are capable of supporting that, and they will need to be mapped in Ariba. So we'll discuss that process coming up. And then there are services commodity codes. Services commodity codes, or abbreviated ASCC, are those codes that were previously used by Ariba Services Procurement Module, which was a separate module of the system that has now been largely replaced by Fieldglass. Fieldglass is discussed in a separate presentation. So, what are all the touch points for commodity codes in Ariba? I started off this presentation by mentioning that commodity codes drive quite a few different pieces of functionality. The first is defaulting of accounting information. Using the ERP commodity code map, which we'll look at later, we can actually default accounting for you to make your requisition process that much simpler and efficient. Secondly, commodity codes are used in tax calculations. Out of the box, when an incoming invoice gets into Ariba, the system will look at the ship from, where are the goods coming from, the ship to, where are they being sent, and the commodity code. And it will primarily use those 3 fields to calculate expected tax. We will then compare that to what was sent on the invoice, and if the expected tax does not match what was sent, we will flag a discrepancy. The third area where commodity codes are used is approval rules. Commodity-based approvals are a quite common requirement with almost all customers. For example, if you're ordering an IT commodity, perhaps a laptop or a server, more often than not that needs to be routed for special approval to our IT team. And that's how commodities can be used to drive approvals. The fourth area that commodities can affect is receiving. We can define different receiving types based on commodity. So receipts occur based on different actions. And we can also do auto receiving. based on commodity. Finally, in reporting or Ariba analysis, you can include commodity codes in reports, and you can actually base reports off of commodity codes as well. In fact, there's a large number of prepackaged reports that come with the system, and quite a few of those are driven or include the commodity codes. This slide illustrates a commodity code search in Ariba. So we are searching for commodity code 44, which happens to represent office supplies. You'll notice that when you search for it in this manner, and you can search based on ID, as you see illustrated on top, or based on name, it will bring back anything containing that string. So in this case, because we searched for 44, you can see that it's brought back this first commodity code ending in 44. It's brought back commodity code 44 by itself. And basically anywhere where it finds 44 within an 8-digit UNSPSC code, it will return that for you. Otherwise, you could also search based on the name of the commodity code, if you know that. Regardless of how you search, you can click the little triangles next to a commodity code to drill down to the next level. So you notice under Office Equipment and Accessories, which is commodity code 44, that's the highest or the parent level. I'm clicking into the triangle, coming down to the next level, which is Office and Desk Accessories. If I drill down further, I can go to the 6-digit and the 8-digit level as well. So this shows you the hierarchical nature of commodity codes. Getting into that in a little more detail, the UNSPSC codes, or United Nations Standard Products and Services codes, as I mentioned, go anywhere from 2 digits all the way down to 8 digits. UNSPSC is a concept that was developed by the United Nations Development Program as well as Dun & Bradstreet. And it is the standard and the most efficient and accurate way to classify your commodities. And that is what Ariba uses. As I showed in the previous slide, there can be a hierarchy of these 4 pairs of 2-digit numbers, and it can go anywhere from 2 digits down to 8 digits. So here is a simple example. 44 is office equipment and supplies. If I drill down one level further, that would be office supplies, 4412. If I take that one step further, 441217, that's writing instruments. And at the most specific level, 44121706, that's wooden pencils. So you can see how we get more specific and granular as we go. It is possible to have wildcards as well. And that is, the system is going to look for the most specific level possible. In this case, an 8-digit level. If it's not able to find what it's looking for, it will climb one level higher and look for the 6-digit mapping. If it cannot find that, it will go to the 4-digit and finally to the 2-digit. So here is an example of that. The item in my shopping cart is boron, which has an 8-digit UNSPSC code. When the system looks into the commodity code in the ERP map file, it cannot find these 8 digits. So then it will look for 6 digits, 12, 14, 19. If it cannot find that, it will look for 4 digits. And finally, if it cannot find that, it will look for 2 digits. So you can see here in the lookup table that we have, when it looks in the ERP commodity code map, it finds 2 digits. And that's going to tie to account 3. When we talk about mapping our commodity data and setting up our accounting, there are 3 files that are vitally important. In addition to the rest of your master data, you first want to set up the file called account.csv. And the file structure is illustrated here. It's typically used when you want to map a single commodity code to multiple accounting fields. So this file does 2 things. It establishes what our valid GL accounts are, our general ledger, and it also lets us map single commodity codes to multiple accounting fields. Typically it has 3 fields, 3 columns: unique name, name, and description. Secondly, we have the ERP commodity code.csv. And this is if we have custom commodity codes in our ERP that we'd like to maintain in Ariba, we can define them here. Regardless of what your backend system is, whether it's SAP, Oracle, or PeopleSoft, or some other ERP, you'll generally see these 4 column headers in that file. You'll have a unique name for the commodity code to uniquely define it, a name, which is like a short name, a description, and a category ID. Once we have these first 2 files defined, the third file brings it all together. That's the ERP commodity code map.csv. This is a very important file because this is what we use to drive accounting. This maps commodity codes to accounting information, including account type, account category, and potentially even purchase groups. As we said before, account defaulting is very helpful. Not only does it make your procurement process more streamlined and efficient, it eliminates human error. So this is definitely one of the most important files, and we'll talk about this further in this slide deck. If your backend ERP is SAP, this slide illustrates how we can use a commodity code to drive our accounting. Now keep in mind, all of our accounting elements must be set up first individually. Things like our company code would be in companycode.csv, our cost center would be in costcenter.csv, and so forth. But once you have all that in place, based on the item you put in your shopping cart, it will have a commodity code. That commodity code in turn will drive your accounting. And if your backend is SAP, that will drive things like the material group, the general ledger account, our SAP purchase group, our account type, and so forth. So one commodity code can be used to drive quite a few things. If your backend system is PeopleSoft, it works in a similar function. In this case, a commodity code can be used to drive our partition commodity code, our PeopleSoft set ID, which is very important in a PeopleSoft environment, our account codes, our shipping address, our account type, and so forth. Finally, if you have what's called a simple generic variant of Ariba, that means your backend is Oracle or some other types of generic ERPs. The same functionality holds true. We can use a commodity code to drive generic accounting. Particularly, that's a partition commodity code, company, GL account, sub-account, cost center, business unit, and so forth. So it really drives the main accounting fields no matter what your backend ERP system happens to be. Following is an example of how we set up the ERP commodity code map.csv file. It's a fairly straightforward file. Looking at the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that we're mapping from a commodity code to an account. Here, this is regardless of dollar range, this is across the board. So for example, if my commodity code is 10, that will default for me account 1 when I'm creating my requisition. If my commodity code is 13, it will default account 4, and so forth. It is possible to do multiple mapping, which is when there is a dollar amount involved as well. And in this example, you can see the file structure is similar, but we have 2 additional columns. We have a minimum amount and a maximum amount. By virtue of these dollar thresholds, we can have multiple records for the same commodity code. For example, if my commodity code is 10 and my purchase is up to $2,000, then I'm going to default account 1 on my requisition. But if I choose that same commodity, commodity 10, and I'm over 2,000, instead it's going to default account 8. So this is a multiple mapping example using dollar thresholds. So I've touched upon some of this already, but there's quite a few benefits of using commodity code mapping. The first, as we saw from the previous slide, is automatic defaulting of our accounting. This will default account for you automatically based on what commodity you've chosen, based on the item you put in your shopping cart. This will lead to a faster purchasing process overall because you don't have to worry about what accounting to default. Not all users will be aware of what accounts to use. And it allows less human intervention. We all know that the more human intervention, the more chances for human error. This way you're streamlining and automating your process. And in the end, you wind up with comparatively more accurate accounting information, especially during invoice reconciliation. As far as the 4 areas we talked about earlier that commodities affect, approval rules, we saw that using the commodity approvers.csv, we can add special approvers based on commodity to the approval flow of any document. The approver can be an individual user or an approval group, and that helps us to automate our approval process. Receiving, we talked about earlier that you can receive based on commodity code, whether you're receiving based on quantity, which is the out-of-the-box setting, by dollar amount, or you're using one or more of our auto-receiving mechanisms. You can use the receipt by commodity code file to drive receiving based on commodities. On the invoicing side, when an invoice comes into Ariba, it is reconciled. The invoice is compared with its associated purchase order or contract, and also the goods receipts. If we detect any discrepancies, we will trigger invoice exceptions. Those invoice exceptions are standard across the board. However, it is possible to have what are called exception overrides based on commodity codes or suppliers. An invoice override based on a commodity code just means that if the invoice comes in and it triggers that exception, we may have different routing, different exception handling, and we may have different tolerances just based on that commodity code. So commodities can be used in that manner. And finally, in tax calculations. When an incoming invoice is evaluated, Ariba, if you're using Ariba's tax functionality, which is optional, it will evaluate the shipping addresses, the ship from and the ship to, as well as the commodity code. So it's going to look at those values in tax code lookup file, and it will derive or calculate the expected tax. So you can see just by using commodity codes, we're streamlining all 4 of these different processes in Ariba. So a little bit more detail into each of these 4. First, I had mentioned commodity approvals. And for any document in Ariba, whether it's a requisition or a goods receipt or an invoice, we can configure approvals based on commodity codes. My example that I used before is an IT item. Typically based on IT commodities, we would route to an IT approver. This more often than not leverages a file called commodityapprovers.csv, which simply specifies for a given commodity code who the special approver, the commodity-based approver, should be. The example that you see here illustrates that for these particular commodities, for example, 45111616, that's a facilities commodity, so it should go to the facilities manager group. Meanwhile, commodity 43211,501, that is an IT commodity. It's a computer server, so that should go to the IS manager. An approver can also be an individual person versus a group, but this is just to illustrate how commodity-based approvals are driven. Within receiving, I mentioned to you that you can do receiving types based on commodity code. This slide illustrates that there's many different receiving types that we can set up and drive based on anywhere from a 2-digit to an 8-digit commodity code. So the receipt by commodity code.csv file is used for this purpose, and you can see the sample file structure here. So for example, if it's a paper products commodity, which is 1411, we are going to do receiving based on count, and we're going to require asset information to be entered in our goods receipt. But if it is commodity code 44101801, which is for calculators, in that case we're going to do auto receiving. So this file can be used to define the different receiving types and mechanisms. And on the bottom half of the slide, you can see there's also different triggers for receipts. If you're doing auto receiving, for example, you can trigger that based on quantity, based on dollar amount, etc., based on an order date or a due date. So there's a lot of flexibility here. You can also do auto receiving based on when the invoice comes in or when a reconciliation occurs. And all of these different types of receiving can be based on a commodity. That is the common tie here. Invoice exception overrides. I touched upon this earlier, but this is being able to designate different routing, different approval routing, and different tolerances for an invoice exception based on commodity. It's also possible to do this based on supplier. This way, when an invoice comes in and we evaluate it, if we're going to trigger an exception, we may have special routing and tolerances based on commodity. This, of course, allows for more efficient invoice reconciliation and exception handling. It is possible, for example, that IT commodities may have different tolerances and different routing than non-IT commodities, so we can distinguish the two in this manner. Finally, the expected tax on incoming invoices is also calculated based on commodity codes, amongst other criteria. In particular, Ariba uses a two-step process to derive the expected tax. First, the system will look at the incoming invoice and examine the commodity codes. Then it will take a look at where the goods are coming from, the ship from address, and where they're being sent, the ship to address. Based on that, it will derive a tax code. Then, in a second table, the system will look up that tax code and find the associated tax rate. This is how the system will derive how much tax is expected. If the tax on the incoming invoice is anything different, we will flag a discrepancy. The bottom half of this slide, you can see the tax code lookup file, and this is how it's set up for the various variants. So if your backend system is PeopleSoft, your tax code lookup file may look like this, where the commodity code is one of the columns, and based on that we may derive the tax code. If you have an SAP backend, it functions in a similar manner. You may have commodity codes in a column here, and you can use that along with the ship from and ship to derive the tax code. Finally, if you are in a generic variant, which means your backend is Oracle or any other ERP, again, we can use commodity codes in the tax code lookup file to determine the tax code. In any of these cases, once we have the tax code, we use that to go into another table and find the associated tax rate. So again, commodity codes can be a primary component of this calculation. Now that you have an idea of how commodity codes work, how do you begin the exercise of determining what commodity codes you want in your system? Well, first, Ariba does recommend that we use the relevant UN SPSC codes. As stated earlier, that is the standard, and that is what comes with Ariba. Now, Ariba comes with a very large set, a full set of these commodity codes, and we recommend that you narrow this down first. You certainly will not be using all the commodity codes, so we recommend you start with the master list of all commodity codes, and then you break it down into different categories. What are the commodity codes that are going to be used overall? What are the commodity codes that we have to have in place for any catalogs, any supplier catalogs we plan to load in the system? What are the commodity codes we may need for contracts and also for non-catalog purchases? Remember, with a non-catalog purchase, the user actually has to choose a commodity code from a list. So we want to make sure they have the appropriate codes to choose from, and only the appropriate codes. And then we may have the material group partition commodity code mapping in the code mapping file. So basically, once we've identified the types of commodity codes we need for each of these cases, we can then use the commodity code map, the ERP commodity code map, to map that to accounting. So this is sort of the process that we begin with. Start with the broad list of commodity codes, which is quite extensive. Narrow it down significantly based on these types of transactions: regular transactions, contracts, catalogs, non-catalogs, etc. And that way you can take that narrowed down list and map that to accounting codes. The ERP commodity code map file, as I mentioned before, is the primary file that we use to drive these mappings. The bottom half of the slide shows an example from an SAP variant of what this may look like. So you can see that we have the account types listed here, the shipping information, material group, and then we have the commodity code that pertains to each. So for example, if I am commodity code 1, if that is in my shopping cart based on the items I've chosen, the system will look in the ERP commodity code map file, and it will note to default for me item category M, account category P for project, company code 1000, SAP purchase group 101, with an account type of EXP NBHW, and the following shipping and material groups. So you can see that a commodity code, just by virtue of being defined in this file along with a mapping, can be used to default your accounting for you. Please remember that this is highly beneficial because this will allow for a smoother purchasing process and less human error. So as far as next steps, now that you have an idea of how commodity codes work in the system and how they're configured, as I mentioned, you're going to want to review the list of all the UNSPSC codes that came with Ariba. It is a full set and a very large list of these codes, and narrow that down to just those codes that you think are necessary for your implementation. Next, we want to evaluate, do we have the need for custom commodity codes? Does our back-end ERP system have custom codes that we need to map into Ariba? Please note that these custom codes can be mapped in or loaded in lieu of the UNSPSC codes, or in addition, some additional custom codes can be mapped along with UNSPSC. So we really need to go through that exercise of determining what commodity codes are required, and if there are custom ERP commodity codes, to get those mapped to UNSPSC codes. Once we have an idea of that, then we can actually load a subset of data using our master data files. So using all of the master data files like account.csv, cost center, company, and so forth, we can load that base data and then create the ERP commodity code map.csv. So once we go through this exercise, at least we would have a subset of data in our test system, and then we can proceed with unit testing, where we actually add the various commodities to our shopping cart and ensure that the expected accounting defaults for us. Thank you for listening to this recording. At this stage, you should be ready to begin your discussion on commodity codes.